The bristles of the broom scraped against concrete as Hoa Nguyen raised it high above her head, her face contorted with fury. "Get away from my property, you disease carrier!" she shrieked, her voice cracking like a whip through the peaceful morning air of Maple Grove subdivision. The 12-year-old boy stumbled backward, his backpack sliding off one shoulder as terror filled his wide brown eyes. He had only been walking to school, taking the same route he'd used for months, when this woman had emerged from her pristine lawn like a vengeful spirit. The morning sun cast long shadows between the cookie-cutter houses, each with their manicured lawns and matching mailboxes. This was supposed to be sanctuary, a place where families felt safe, where children could walk to school without fear. But as Mrs. Hoa Nguyen's broom came down toward the frightened child, that illusion shattered like glass on pavement. "Your breathing spreads bacteria," Hoa screamed, chasing the boy as he broke into a run. Her perfectly styled black hair whipped around her face as she pursued him down Elmwood Street, her expensive running shoes slapping against the sidewalk. "You're bringing obesity energy into my clean community." The boy's name was Marcus Thompson, though Hoa had never bothered to learn it. To her, he was simply an eyesore, a walking reminder of everything she believed was wrong with the world. As he ran, his breathing grew labored, not from any disease as she claimed, but from the simple physics of a larger child trying to escape a grown woman wielding a weapon. 3 weeks earlier, Hoa had been a different person. At least, that's what she told herself. She had moved to Maple Grove after her divorce, seeking a fresh start in what the real estate brochures called an exclusive community for discerning homeowners. The house had cost her nearly every penny of her settlement, but it represented something more valuable than money. It represented control, perfection, a life where everything could be exactly as she wanted it. Her daily routine had become ritualistic. Each morning at precisely 6:30, she would emerge from her 2-story colonial to retrieve the newspaper, her eyes scanning the neighborhood for any sign of imperfection. A dandelion on the Harrisons' lawn, a bicycle left carelessly on the sidewalk, and increasingly, the sight of Marcus Thompson walking to school with his backpack bouncing against his rounded shoulders. The first time she saw him, she had simply frowned and made a mental note. The second time, she had called the Homeowners Association to inquire about regulations regarding undesirable elements in the neighborhood. By the third week, she had convinced herself that his very presence was somehow diminishing her property value, that his existence was a personal affront to everything she had worked to build. Mrs. Chen from the corner house told me she saw rats near her garbage since that boy started walking this way. She had complained to her neighbor, Janet Morrison, over coffee the previous weekend. "It's not natural. Someone that size, it attracts pests, lowers the whole tone of the neighborhood." Janet had shifted uncomfortably in her chair, stirring sugar into her latte with unnecessary force. "Hoa, he's just a child walking to school. His family lives over on Oak Street. They have every right to use these sidewalks." Rights. Hoa had laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "What about my rights? I paid good money for this house, for this lifestyle. I shouldn't have to look at that every morning from my kitchen window." But Janet Morrison had been thinking about that conversation all week, a seed of unease growing in her chest. She had lived in Maple Grove for 15 years, had watched dozens of children grow up on these streets. Never had she heard anyone speak with such venom about a child. Any child. When she heard the screaming that Tuesday morning, she knew immediately who was involved. From her kitchen window, Janet watched in horror as Hoa chased Marcus down the street. The boy's feet tangled together as he tried to look back over his shoulder, and he went down hard on the concrete, his knees scraping against the rough surface. The sound of his sob carried across the morning air like a physical blow. "Please don't hurt me," Marcus whimpered, scrambling to his feet as Hoa approached, with the broom still raised. Blood trickled down his shin from where he had scraped his knee, and his school uniform was torn at the elbow. "I'm just going to school. I didn't do anything wrong." "You exist wrong," Hoa spat, jabbing the broom handle toward him like a spear. "Look at you. You're a walking advertisement for everything that's diseased in this society. Your parents should be ashamed, letting you walk around like that, contaminating decent neighborhoods." The cruelty in her voice was matched only by the satisfaction that flickered across her face as she watched the child cower. This was power, she realized. This was control. For the first time since her divorce, since her world had crumbled around her, she felt in command of something. But she was not alone in witnessing this moment of power. 20 feet away, concealed by the shadow of an oak tree, stood Maria Santos. Maria worked as a nanny for the Rodriguez family, and she had been walking their golden retriever when the commotion began. Her phone was already in her hand, recording everything. Maria had seen bullying before. She had worked with children for 12 years, had comforted countless victims of schoolyard cruelty. But this was different. This was an adult, a grown woman, terrorizing a child with the systematic precision of someone who had thought about this moment, planned for it, savored it. "Get up and get out of my sight," Hoa commanded, pointing the broom down the street. "And tell your parents that if I see you on this street again, I'm calling the police about the health hazard you represent." Marcus struggled to his feet, his injured knee making him wince with each step. He looked back only once as he limped toward school, his eyes meeting Maria's across the distance. In that moment, she saw something that would haunt her for weeks afterward. It wasn't just fear in the boy's expression, or even pain from his physical injuries. It was a deeper wound, the kind that comes from being told you don't deserve to exist in the world. As Hoa turned back toward her house, triumphant in her victory, she failed to notice the woman with the phone, failed to see the other neighbors who had emerged from their homes to witness the spectacle. She was so consumed with her own sense of righteousness that she missed the moment when her private hatred became a public crime. That afternoon, Maria Santos walked into the Maple Grove Police Department with her phone in hand and a determination in her heart that surprised even her. "I want to file a report about child abuse," she told Officer Jennifer Walsh at the front desk. "I have video evidence of an adult woman attacking a child with a weapon." Officer Walsh had been expecting another routine report about noise complaints or petty theft. She was not prepared for the footage that Maria showed her. The clear evidence of an adult woman chasing a terrified child with a broom while screaming about disease and contamination. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to sit down and tell me everything you witnessed. This is going to be a formal investigation." While Maria gave her statement, Marcus Thompson sat in the nurse's office at Maple Grove Elementary, having his scraped knees cleaned and bandaged. The school nurse, Mrs. Patterson, had seen many playground injuries over her 20-year career. But something about this boy's wounds troubled her. They weren't consistent with a typical fall. And when she gently asked what had happened, Marcus had simply stared at the floor and whispered, "A lady said I don't belong in her neighborhood." Mrs. Patterson made a note in Marcus's file and placed a call to his emergency contact. The phone rang 3 times before a man's voice answered, professional and distracted. "This is David Thompson." "Mr. Thompson, this is Linda Patterson, the nurse at Maple Grove Elementary. Your son Marcus had an incident this morning on his way to school. He's not seriously injured, but I think you should know what happened." There was a pause on the line, the sound of papers being shuffled and a chair creaking. What kind of incident did he fall? Sir, I think it would be better if we discussed this in person. Would you be able to come to the school? David Thompson was the kind of man who noticed details. It came with his profession. 15 years as an investigative journalist for the Metro Daily Herald. He had built his career on asking the right questions, on seeing the stories that others missed, on giving voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. But as he sat in the nurse's office listening to his son describe the morning's events, he realized that the most important story of his life had nearly slipped past him entirely. She said I was a disease carrier, Dad, Marcus explained, his voice small and uncertain. She said I was making the neighborhood dirty just by walking through it. David felt something cold settle in his chest, a familiar anger that he usually reserved for corrupt politicians and corporate criminals. But this was different. This was personal. This was his child, his gentle, intelligent, creative son who had never hurt anyone in his 12 years of life. Son, I need you to tell me exactly what happened. Every detail you can remember. And Marcus. He knelt down so he could look directly into his son's eyes. You did nothing wrong. Nothing. Do you understand me? As Marcus recounted the morning's events, David's journalistic instincts kicked into high gear. He asked careful questions, took detailed notes, and began to see the larger story that was unfolding. This wasn't just about one woman's cruelty toward one child. This was about prejudice, about community standards, about who belonged and who didn't, about the kind of hatred that could flourish in places that prided themselves on being civilized. By Thursday, HOA had almost forgotten about the incident with the boy. She had returned to her morning routine of newspaper retrieval and neighborhood surveillance, pleased that her direct action had apparently solved the problem. Marcus Thompson had not walked down Elmwood Street since Tuesday, and she took this as validation of her methods. She was arranging flowers in her front yard when the police car pulled into her driveway. 2 officers emerged, their faces professionally neutral as they approached her front door. "Ma'am, are you HOA Nguyen?" asked the taller officer, checking his notebook. "Yes, that's me. Is there a problem in the neighborhood? I've been keeping an eye on things, you know. Very vigilant about maintaining community standards." The officers exchanged a glance. "Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions about an incident that occurred on Tuesday morning involving you and a minor child." For the first time since Tuesday, HOA felt a flicker of uncertainty. "I'm not sure what you mean. I haven't done anything wrong." "Ma'am, we have video evidence of you chasing a child with a broom while making threatening statements. We're going to need you to come with us to answer some questions." The word video hit HOA like a physical blow. Video meant evidence, meant permanence, meant that her moment of righteous action had been captured and could be examined, judged, used against her. "I was protecting my property," she said, her voice rising. "I was protecting the neighborhood from undesirable elements." "Ma'am, you can explain your side of the story at the station. Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." As the handcuffs clicked into place, HOA saw her neighbors emerging from their houses, drawn by the spectacle of police cars and flashing lights. Janet Morrison stood on her front porch, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. The Harrisons were at their window, their teenage daughter recording everything on her phone. Mrs. Chen from the corner house shook her head sadly and retreated inside. For the second time in a week, HOA was the center of attention on Elmwood Street. But this time, the power dynamics had shifted dramatically. This time, She was not the one in control. The arrest made the local news that evening. A brief segment about a woman charged with child endangerment in an upscale neighborhood. But David Thompson was not content with a 30-second news brief. He was crafting something larger, something that would examine not just what HOA had done, but why she had felt entitled to do it, and what it revealed about the communities people built around exclusion and hatred. His article, published the following Sunday on the front page of the Metro Daily Herald, was titled "The Broom and the Boy: When Neighborhood Watch Becomes Neighborhood Terror." It was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, weaving together the personal story of one child's trauma with the broader social forces that had created the conditions for such cruelty. David had interviewed Maria Santos, the nanny whose courage in reporting the incident had made justice possible. He had spoken with other neighbors who admitted they had seen HOA's increasingly erratic behavior, but had chosen to ignore it rather than confront it. He had researched the Homeowners Association bylaws that HOA claimed gave her authority over neighborhood standards, revealing them to be perfectly legal documents that made no mention of excluding children based on their appearance. Most powerfully, he had interviewed his own son, allowing Marcus to speak in his own words about what it felt like to be told you don't belong in the world simply because of how you look. "I just wanted to go to school," Marcus had told his father during the interview. "I didn't know that walking down a street could make someone so angry. I didn't know that me existing could be wrong." The article went viral within hours of its online publication. It was shared thousands of times on social media, commented on by child psychologists and civil rights activists, and picked up by national news outlets. The video that Maria Santos had taken was released as part of the story, showing the world exactly what had happened on that Tuesday morning in Maple Grove subdivision. Hua watched the news coverage from her living room, her face burning with shame and fury as she saw herself on television, broom raised, chasing a terrified child. The reporter's voice was clinical as it described the charges against her: child endangerment, assault, and harassment. But the real punishment came from the court of public opinion. By Monday morning, there were protesters outside her house. Not many. Perhaps a dozen people with signs reading, "Protect all children," and "Bullying is a crime." Her neighbors, who had once seemed so similar to her in their desire for order and exclusivity, now crossed the street to avoid walking past her house. The phone calls started Tuesday, first from her mortgage company, asking questions about her legal troubles and their potential impact on her loan status. Then, from her employer, a high-end real estate firm that prided itself on serving only the most distinguished clients. The conversation was brief and professional, but the message was clear: her services were no longer required. Wednesday brought a visit from her Homeowners Association president, a thin man named Gerald Hoffman, who had always seemed to approve of her vigilant neighborhood monitoring. But now he stood on her doorstep with a formal notice, his expression carefully neutral. "Hua, the board has met and discussed your recent situation. While we appreciate your past commitment to neighborhood standards, we feel that your actions have created a liability for the association. We're going to need you to address these behavioral issues, perhaps seek some professional help, if you want to remain in good standing." Professional help. Hoa's voice was sharp with disbelief. "Gerald, I was protecting our property values. I was doing what we all believed in." Hua, none of us believed in chasing children with garden tools. That was something else entirely." By Thursday, the eviction notice appeared on her door. Her mortgage company had moved quickly once her employment status changed, and the legal troubles had given them additional grounds to accelerate the foreclosure process. The pristine house that had represented her fresh start, her control over her environment, was being taken away piece by piece. That evening, Maple Grove subdivision held an emergency community meeting in the elementary school cafeteria. David Thompson had not planned to attend, but Marcus had asked him to go. "I want to see if they'll let me walk to school again," his son had said, with the kind of courage that made David's chest swell with pride. The cafeteria was packed. Nearly every household in the subdivision represented. Janet Morrison stood at the podium, serving as the interim community liaison. "We're here tonight to discuss what happened in our neighborhood last week, and more importantly, to discuss what kind of community we want to be going forward." Maria Santos stood up first, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I've worked with children for 12 years, and I've never seen an adult terrorize a child the way I witnessed last Tuesday. But what troubled me almost as much was how many of us saw warning signs and chose to ignore them. We can't let our desire for a nice neighborhood blind us to actual cruelty." One by one, neighbors began to speak. Some admitted they had heard HOA's complaints about Marcus and had remained silent rather than challenge her. Others confessed that they had been uncomfortable with the increasing exclusivity of the neighborhood association, the subtle ways that certain families were made to feel unwelcome. Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman from the corner house, spoke with a quiet dignity that commanded attention. "I came to this country 50 years ago with my husband and children. We were different then. The wrong color, the wrong language, the wrong customs. But our neighbors chose to welcome us instead of excluding us. And that choice made all the difference in what kind of life we could build here. We have the same choice to make now." When it was David Thompson's turn to speak, he walked to the podium with Marcus at his side. "My son asked me to bring him tonight because he wanted you to see him as a person, not as whatever label someone else might put on him. He's 12 years old. He likes to read science fiction books and build model airplanes. He helps his grandmother with her grocery shopping every Saturday. He's never hurt anyone, never broken any laws, never done anything except exist in a body that someone decided didn't meet their standards." David's voice grew stronger as he continued. "But this isn't really about my son, or even about Hoang Nguyen. It's about what kind of community we choose to build together. Do we build walls to keep out anyone who makes us uncomfortable? Or do we build bridges that make room for everyone?" The meeting lasted 3 hours, but by the end, several concrete changes had been proposed and voted on. The Homeowners Association bylaws would be revised to explicitly prohibit discrimination and harassment. A community garden would be established where children could play and neighbors could interact naturally. Most importantly, a neighborhood watch program would be created focused on actual safety rather than enforcing arbitrary standards of belonging. Janet Morrison was elected as the new association president, running on a platform of inclusion and actual community building. Her first official act was to send a letter to every household in the subdivision, establishing new community standards based on respect, kindness, and mutual support. 3 months later, Marcus Thompson walked down Elmwood Street to school every morning without fear. Other children had joined him, turning his solitary walk into a small parade of backpack-wearing students. The neighbors had begun to learn their names, to wave from their windows, to see them as part of the community, rather than intruders in it. Hoang Nguyen had moved away, foreclosed out of the house that was supposed to represent her perfect life. The last anyone heard, she was living in a small apartment across town, working at a chain store that didn't require background checks. The criminal charges had been reduced to community service and mandatory counseling, but the social consequences had been far more severe than any legal penalty. The house where she had lived was purchased by a young family with 3 children, including a daughter who was deaf and communicated in sign language. Janet Morrison organized a neighborhood sign language class, taught by the new family, that met every Saturday morning in the community garden. By winter, half the neighborhood could sign "Good morning" and "Have a nice day" to their new neighbor. David Thompson's article had been nominated for several journalism awards, but the recognition he valued most was much smaller and more personal. Marcus had framed the newspaper front page and hung it in his bedroom, not as a reminder of trauma, but as proof that sometimes, when people choose to speak up instead of staying silent, justice and healing are possible. On a warm spring morning, exactly 1 year after the incident with the broom, Marcus Thompson walked down Elmwood Street, surrounded by a group of neighborhood children. They were laughing about something that had happened in their science class, debating the merits of different science fiction authors, planning a weekend expedition to build a treehouse in the community garden. Maria Santos watched from her usual spot under the oak tree, no longer a hidden observer, but an active participant in the neighborhood's daily life. She had been hired as the official coordinator for the community garden, a job that let her use her love of children and growing things to help build something beautiful where something ugly had once taken root. The maple trees that gave the subdivision its name were in full bloom, their branches creating a canopy of green over the sidewalks where children walked safely to school. The morning sun cast warm shadows between the houses, each one now truly a home rather than a fortress against the world. This was what community looked like when people chose connection over exclusion, when they decided that everyone's children deserved to walk safely to school, when they understood that property values were meaningless if human values were destroyed in the process of protecting them. The story of the broom and the boy had ended, but the story of what came after was still being written every morning, in the laughter of children walking to school, in the waves exchanged between neighbors, in the choice to see difference as richness rather than threat. It was a better story, a more hopeful story, and it belonged to everyone who had chosen to help write it.